we're very happy that Dr. Deniece Dortch is a member of our faculty. Many of you have gotten to know Dr. Dortch, who came to us from already an impressive early career, starting with her PhD from the University of Wisconsin, and a master's degree from Teachers College, Columbia University, an MA in Intercultural Service Leadership and Management from the School for International Training in Vermont, a BA from Eastern Michigan. And now you're really at the best of all of those places, GShed of the George Washington University. Dr. Dortch is a member of our higher education administration faculty. She is actively doing research and publishing on issues related to self-efficacy of graduate students, sense of belonging of undergraduate students of color at predominantly white institutions. It's a great pleasure to have you at this latest episode of our Ecology of Education series. Deniece, I just want to thank you in advance. The title of Deniece's talk today is Black Taxes. I have to admit, when I read this quickly, I thought, ooh, somebody's going to finally fix my argument with the Internal Revenue Service. And then I read it again. It's Black Taxes. African-American doctoral students experiencing tokenism at predominantly white institutions. Dr. Dortch, it's going to be up to you whether and how you want to handle questions along the way, but people who do have questions, please just send us a note either to Victoria or Meg, or I suppose me, or directly to Dr. Dortch, and we'll make sure that we have time for some good conversation. Thank you in advance. It's all yours, Professor Dortch.
Well, thank you, Dr. Poirier, Dean Poirier. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present my scholarship today. This is, so you know, it's a work in progress. Just give me a second to share the PowerPoint with you. So you all can see that. And then okay, great. So yes, we're going to be talking about Black taxes. As I just mentioned, this is an unfinished manuscript that I'm working on right now, and that I'm presenting to you today. So I welcome your comments and your questions, certainly at the end. I'll do a little bit of an intro. I'll talk about the research, what grounds the research, the literature, and the conceptual framework that I'm going to use, the way that I collected the data by going through a little bit of the methods. We'll go over the findings. I'll give you my thoughts about it in terms of what I learned and what this means, and then give you a few recommendations to sort of move us forward. Dr. King gave a talk to the Southern Methodist University in 1966 on the future of integration. And during that talk, he says that it would be a realistic position that he wants us to think about the future of integration as we think about race relations. And he says we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. And we have to remember that the university was developed with white male students in mind, and people of color have only recently in our history have been admitted to some of these predominantly white institutions. And so tokenism has sufficed to appease some of the masses and prevent essentially national revolt from people of color. Now, Dr. King goes on to say that, that if we're to truly have an integrated society, it'll never develop through tokenism. that we get a few Black folks in formerly all white schools. He actually used the term Negroes in formerly all white schools, and to say then that we have integrated schools. Or we get a few Negroes, as he says, in fairly good jobs in plants. And then we begin to say that we have equal job opportunities in plants. And then it sort of goes on down line from there. But the fact is that this kind of tokenism is much more subtle and can be much more depressing to the victims of tokenism than all out resistance. And so we have a long, long way to go in dealing with this problem, but it's not only a Southern problem that we face, it's a national problem. So I want to start off by talking about how tokenism shows up in the media. So when studies do focus on African American students or students of color in graduate education, tokenism is portrayed as a component of racialization or marginalization faced by these populations as opposed to their central experience. And so some of the studies have revealed that African American graduate students experience tokenism in graduate programs in science, technology, counseling, education, student affairs, and nonprofit work. And it can be amplified by intersectional identities, which includes racial identity. Not only does this occurrence manifest among women of color, but also Black graduate students face this across multiple gender identities. Black women and Black men, for instance, can be tokenized by their intersectional social identities. And simultaneously, tokenism manifests in various forms as underrepresentation, like being the only one, or in the form of hypervisibility, as you can see, or speaking for one's whole race, and as a physical and psychological word. It impacts their self-esteem, their efficacy, and their belonging. So this research today, this particular study explores how 9 African-American doctoral students, doctoral candidates in fact, experienced tokenism at a predominantly white institution. And so in order to gain some of this information, we looked at campus climate studies. We looked at studies that looked at students who felt senses of isolation or who were structurally or systemically isolated. We looked at studies that specifically talked about students being tokenized, and we looked at students and their socialization into the academy. So the conceptual framework, the theories and the concepts that sort of undergird this work is, first and foremost, we used racial microaggressions, which are the intentional and unintentional verbal and behavioral insults that communicate derogatory or hostile slights aimed at a person through human and environmental encounters. There's a few forms. There's micro insults, which could be unconscious. There is micro assaults, which are often conscious and more explicit, and then invalidations, which are also often unconscious, and those might be verbal comments, behaviors that might exclude or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a person of color. Additionally, Darrow and Sue identified also 9 categories with distinct themes. And that might be also feeling like you're an alien in your own land or a foreigner in your own land. Color blindness, it could also include a denial of individual racism, the myth of meritocracy, pathologizing cultural values and communication styles, feeling like you're a second-class citizen, and also environmental invalidation. The other frame that we often use for this work is socialization theory, and that's the process of learning and internalizing cultural norms and behavior and incorporating it into your own identity. And so that includes knowledge acquisition, and that's the stage where you learn about the rules of the department, the terminology, the norms, your investment, and that's the amount of time and resources that you put into being a student, and then the amount of involvement that you have in your programs. And so these frames are really important when we're thinking about how students may experience tokenism at their institutions. So when we think about the research itself, and we look at the site is Anthony Michael University, which is Anthony Michael's a pseudonym. For a large predominantly white institution in the Midwest, and there were about 40,000 students, 2% of those students were Black, and that included undergraduate and graduate students at the time of the study. There were 1,400 doctoral degree recipients, 25 of those were African American. There's a 50-50 gender split, and at the time, this only includes cisgender men and women. There was or is no data indicating other gender identities. And a little bit about the participants in the study. So the 9 students, Asada, Carmen, Charles, Deshawn, Ivy, John, Monica, Robert, and Sally, they were chosen because they've successfully moved through all the stages and the phases of doctoral study. They were able to successfully communicate what it was like for them moving through each one of those stages. And then each one of them were represented in their, or were underrepresented in their own respective programs. And because of this, we elect to describe them more broadly to maintain their anonymity. They were raised in the Western, Eastern, and Midwestern parts of the United States, respectively. There were 5 cisgender women and 4 cisgender men that participated in the study. And many of them participated in elite public, private, or parochial primary and secondary schools. They ranged from ages 25 to 40. One participant is married, as you can see. Another participant is a parent. All of the participants are classified as full-time students. They represented the fields of humanities, education, engineering, health sciences, natural sciences, and professional schools. Some of them even participated in dual degree programs at the time. 8 of them graduated at the conclusion of the study. So I chose to use hermeneutic phenomenology as my research design, and the way in which I carried out the study. I chose this because phenomenology recognizes, with hermeneutic phenomenology, it recognizes that both the researcher and the subject are subjective and contextual. It seeks to understand and interpret the everyday experiences of people. The goal of hermeneutic phenomenology is to understand how someone is experiencing the world through storytelling, which gives meaning to their perceptions and their experiences. I interviewed the candidates 3 times for 90 minutes each time over the course of 1 academic year. The first interview was all about their academic life, pre-doctoral study, which talked about their expectations, which helped me to understand essentially what their expectations were for moving into graduate study. And then the second interview was all about their day-to-day experiences as doctoral students. And then their third interview was all about the sense making and what does this mean to them. Each participant selected their own names. They chose their own pseudonyms. They were able to, after each interview, they were able to let me know whether or not I was representing what they were saying accurately. And that's how I perform member checks in order to do that. In terms of the analysis, how I analyzed the data, there was about 5 rounds of data analysis in order to complete this work. And if you have more questions about the data analysis process, that sort of thing, we could talk about that through the Q&A. What I learned is that students essentially, they were experiencing tokenism, and tokenism, they use words like blending in, such as a token, and for them that meant trying to blend in, even though they were unsuccessful, but trying to blend in. Diversity was used by participants to illustrate their experiences. The theme tokenism was created based on participant language to illustrate both the burdens of being a token and of being underrepresented. And experientially for the participants in the study, tokenism stems from students of color understanding that they're the only one or one of few of their racial identity, and sometimes racial and gender identity in a white academic setting. And so the ways in which tokenism is negatively experienced often include being the only person in their respective departments. And oftentimes they're describing the main pressures and challenges of what underrepresentation looks like, whether that's having to speak for all people with the same racial or intersectional identity, to the benefit of their white faculty and peers, or it's the expectation of serving as a spokesperson for all Black people. They might have revealed that they'd have to feel like they have to blend in or be used to advance pseudo-diversity plans, or naming themselves as tokens. So the literature says that what is tokenism? Again, tokenism is the practice of making only symbolic efforts towards racial inclusion. It's basically using folks of color to appear that there is racial diversity, or in some cases, racial equality. And how it often shows up, or some examples of that, again, being the only one speaking for one's whole race, serving as a diversity prop, a diversity expert, used to advance pseudo-diversity plans, hypervisibility expected to blend in. And so we're going to see, what I'm now going to show you with some examples of some of these things as Monica, Charles, Carmen, Robert describe sort of the negative sides of tokenism. So here we have hypervisibility. Charles says, I've always been kind of the only one African-American in his department for a long time, so you just kind of get used to blending in. Robert says, I've been a minority in a majority institution pretty much my educational career, so in some ways you just sort of get used to it, but not necessarily accepting it as knowing that things could be better, or wanting things to be better, and working for things to be better. But at some point in time, you just sort of get to know, you just sort of know the type of institution that you're going to, and you just get used to it. So what you'll see here, for example, is you see a sigh, and that's an intentional pause. And that's left there because what hermeneutic phenomenology teaches us is that we also use pauses, sighs, laughter, nonverbal communication, and that's also included often in the text as another layer of data to help us understand how someone is communicating messages to all of us. So a lot of times you'll still see sighs, laughter, someone stutter. You'll often see that throughout this work. Here's an example of diversity spokesperson. And so Monica says, so Monica was in health sciences, and she says, I'm almost representing Black women, you know, because I am a Black woman and I've constantly asked opinions about this. And I've really tried to separate, like I said, this is my opinion, this is my experience. But for a lot of white people, they take my experience as this is all of Black people. And so that's another example where someone is expected to speak for their whole race. Another example is what I call a diversity prop, or being used to advance a diversity agenda. And so Carmen was telling a story about how she was invited to serve on an advisory board, right? One of her advisors asked her to serve on an advisory board. And she says that they specifically asked her and the other minority students that she knew to be on a board for the auditing of their department. And she didn't think anything of it when he asked her, because I was a new student and I was the only student in his lab. And so I was thinking, okay, he's just asking me because I'm a first year, you know, go to audit. And then when I got there, all the other minority students are there. And I'm like, so all of your advisors asked you to come? And the answer was yes. And then there was a closing banquet, and normally the closing banquet, first years don't go. And again, it was me and the other minority students all together at this closing banquet where the first years don't normally get invited to. And we had spots at the head table with the people who were doing the auditing. And at that point, I realized, okay, so this is either one of two things. Either we made a really good impression during the student advisory stuff, or our advisors who did the invitations to the banquet want our department to look like we're racially diverse. And this is the only way to do it, is to have us at this banquet. And so I was just like, okay, so here are our token kids. We're actually doing something about diversity in our department. And that was not at all the truth. 2 African-American students out of 100 white students doesn't make this department diverse. And so here's another example where Carmen is talking about feeling like she was being used to advance diversity plans. So she's in STEM. She's an engineering student. And so she says that there are even fewer in her field, African-American people. And she says, here it seems like you're the prize, right? You're the golden child. You get to represent the colleges if it's diverse. There's only a few of us, and so we get chosen to do lots of FaceTime with people to make it seem as though we have African Americans on campus. So what it means here on this campus is if the campus is moving, it's that the campus is moving forward, even though it isn't. When they get to know you or find out about you, then they want you because they want you to advance their diversity plans. It's not really about you as a researcher. It's about how you add to the diversity in their field. How it makes their workplace look. So they're not really bringing you on to help you, they're bringing you on to help them. And sometimes you just have to use that to your advantage. If you end up getting to where you want to be, and you know they most likely hired you because they want diversity, and you don't know if they're going to treat you right or get you what you want, you just have to go with it. Sometimes there's nowhere else to go. And that's important to know. When students feel like when they are one of few, they feel like oftentimes they have no other options, or respectively, there may not be other options. So they oftentimes will put up with it. And that's an example of that. Here's another example of a student feeling like they were considered a diversity expert on all things. And Monica says, I've been told I'm an expert in diversity and in social justice and in cultural competency, because again, like I said, I'm always kind of called upon. So oftentimes students who are one of few are often end up being the go-to person for all things related to that particular identity. There are also some psychological burdens that exist that arise when it comes from being tokenized. And so here, Ivy says that being the only one, being the only Black person at times, gives me the feeling of inadequacy, feelings of like the imposter syndrome. And Monica says, so little experiences like walking down the hall and no one, this again, no one looks like you, it's exhausting. So here we see examples of how a student may question their own belongingness at an institution when there are very few people that share their identity group. Now, when I asked the participants if they found it at all advantageous to be tokenized at their institution, they did acknowledge that there are some perceived benefits. Now, tokenism, let me just say, does not benefit groups, but there are instances in which the individual participants have not only acknowledged that their institutions are using them to advance, but they are wrestling with and acknowledging the benefits of being only one of few Black people in their programs or school. So Carmen says, I do believe that being an African-American opened doors, not just for the sake of diversity, whether or not it's true or not, that those were the things that got me where I am. It's helped me in the fact that I didn't have to pay for school. And Sally says, yes, I've benefited from the system. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I haven't, but I'm the exception and not the rule. Robert, as he's describing, he was also a health sciences student, and he says that, but for me, I think that it's provided me some opportunities to do things that I may not have been able to do at other schools, or even particularly places like HBCUs for some of the extracurricular things that I've done. So as I mentioned, I think that being one of the only few here has really worked to my advantage as a student and as a leader and just my overall development. And I also think that it's benefited me because I've been able to participate in these leadership roles that are involved in recruiting minority students, that I can see the pitfalls of the organization or of the institution and where things need to be addressed. So there is one more where there was a student, Asada, and Asada, for example, also talked the benefits and was also financial. And she says, you know, that people have put their money into her invested money also. And she said she had one white professor who recently pushed for a scholarship for her because she didn't have the money to pay her rent. So he used his privilege and the power that he had in his department, and he created a scholarship for her because she needed one, because she would happen to be the only one in her program. And without the funding, she was going to have to drop out. So she said that she felt like, because she felt as though she got that scholarship, not simply because of her own merit, but because the institution did not want to have the only Black person in the humanities lead in her particular program. Okay, so let me move on. So some things that are important to know. Tokenism contributes to both the imposter syndrome and racial battle fatigue. So the imposter syndrome is when students feel like they're moving through like they are imposters, like they're going to be found out, that someone's gonna figure out that really they're not supposed to be there. And tokenism exacerbates those experiences. And it also contributes to racial battle fatigue. And that's when you have racially the mundane, everyday environmental stress that Black students experience as a result of racism, of being one of the only few who have to constantly be trying to advocate for resources for themselves, speak on behalf of others, that sort of thing. They get tired. And racial battle fatigue comes from actual battle fatigue that has been applied from the term battle fatigue, where soldiers were given like mandatory rest breaks from when they were in battle. And so for Black people, for African Americans, because racism exists every day and it's omnipresent every day, all day, that we too also suffer from a type of battle fatigue, and it is called racial battle fatigue for us. Undeniably, the collective cost of tokenization of Black graduate students at PWIs are Black taxes, which is an undue burden on the student population. Black taxes, so Padilla in 1994 employed the term accultural taxation, and that describes the challenges that minoritized scholars, due to their underrepresentation in the academy, frequently find themselves having to respond to situations that are imposed upon them by administration, which assumes that Black people are the best suited for specific tasks solely because of their race. Therefore, tokenism essentially undermines racial inclusion because of that. These tasks also include disproportionate service work. It could be mentoring students, mentoring staff. Doctoral students often have dual roles. It could be after disproportionate service or mentoring due to racial status, it could lower academic or scholarly production as a result of this additional service and being called upon as an expert in racial issues. And so when these extra responsibilities and tasks are essentially required from folks to either enter the professoriate, which is what we're asking doctoral students to often do, they can apply to these Black faculty specifically as Black cultural taxes. So faculty, for example, may recall their own graduate professors paying these cultural taxes for their success, or feeling like compelled to mentor students of color because of low racial representation. Though before Black faculty were in the professoriate, they too were previously Black grad students, Black doctoral students, like the people in my study. And so Black doctoral students are experiencing these cultural taxations as well. And so Black tax essentially is the societal charges placed upon African Americans in order to enter and participate in white spaces. So these taxes include the burden of being allowed to, rather than worthy of, enrolling in graduate school. And so it's communicating a message to these students, such as, for us paying for you to be here, you must then do all of these things, right? And so oftentimes it is engaging in respectability politics. It's hard for them to say no. They mediating actions through the lens of gratitude because they were allowed at this predominantly white institution. And so tokenism is, again, the cultural tax Black students end up paying. So I do have a chart that I sort of created to sort of help illustrate that. But I want to say before I get to the chart that the racial maltreatment of Black young people, Fagan says, that at predominantly white public colleges and universities can be thought of as involving a serious misappropriation of funds. Because he says that Black communities as a whole reap a disproportionately small share of the higher education rewards that they help create with their taxes. And so we do all this work and we only get a little bit of pie. And so despite the burdens and the payment that these Black taxes at PWIs, they yield harm as opposed to benefits to the people who pay them. And in addition to these costs, they could be categorized as academic labor, and on another serious cost, again, is racial battle fatigue, as I mentioned earlier. So here's sort of a chart. It also leads to their own self-doubt, and we can see how their overall health and well-being are impacted. Perhaps the most grave costs of Black taxes are in the academy. So when we think about the cost of tokenism, so here are some characteristics of tokenism on your left, right? So we talked about, the literature talks about hypervisibility. My participants talked about hypervisibility. We know that hypervisibility is when you are overwhelmingly seen because you're the only one or one of few. How they're taxed. What that means is how you're taxed. How are Black people taxed? The cost that Black people have to pay. How it is taxing is how that impacts Black people, right? The person who is being taxed. So for hypervisibility, might be the only one in the program, how that affects them, that they're isolated, they're lonely. When they're the diversity spokesperson, it's a disproportionate amount of service because of their race. How is that taxing on them? Lower academic and scholarly production as a result of this work. Think about how many doc students have you asked to serve on every single committee at your institution, right? And it's usually the same ones over and over and over again. Or they're used as a diversity prop that might be used to represent it in the institution and all the promotional materials and the media. I remember I worked for an organization quite some time ago. We used to laugh about it and we call it the diversity shot, because even though the institution might be 98% white, they would strategically find one of every type of group to form this photo. And that would be on all the promotional materials. How that's taxing, you're unsure if you're wanted or valued beyond your identity. And then there's pressure to help the institution to appear diverse. There's also a characteristic of tokenism as a scarcity model. So sometimes it's competition for additional funding, for leadership opportunities. There is intra-racial conflict that often happens due to this model. And so folks might be compelled to work twice as hard just to get access to some of the benefits that their white counterparts have. There may be some not wanting to collaborate or be as cooperative because you don't want to share. Oftentimes it's functioning like a moral compass. So oftentimes how that shows up is students may be frequently asked to respond to situations that are imposed on by others regarding their identity group by the administration. So if something happens, if an incident takes place, sometimes you'll go to that particular identity group to say, hey, is this racist? Or hey, how should I move on this? Or hey, what should I do about this thing? Right? But again, that is one person, that is not a group. Then how it might be taxing is that students can only speak for themselves, not for their whole group. There may be even a denial of racism. And so that's when an institution denies, ignores, or blames Black and Indigenous people of color, are often pitted against one another. How that's taxing on a person is they're often really self-conscious. There's a lot of self-doubt about their place in the academy. And then there's fear. And so there's the burden, again, like I mentioned earlier, of being allowed to rather than worthy of enrolling in graduate school. And so that is, again, being afraid to say no. Because of how that's going to impact not only that individual, but a lot of times how it's going to impact other Black people that come after them if this person says no. So often having to figure out and negotiate gratitude. So some important points to sort of think about as we think about this. So one, because of racial tokenization, participants developed an academic consciousness in order to navigate the cultural politics difference that existed on their college campuses. And so these students might find that tokenism comes at a cost. And that's, again, hidden labor. The academic consciousness means that they possess a particular way of knowing that their social identities are linked to how they're perceived by others in the academy. And so the participants sort of claimed that they were fully aware of their racial status was being used to advance often unfulfilled diversity agendas, and that knowing this fact allowed them to capitalize on leadership and financial opportunities. There were other instances in the study where participants demonstrated a particular type of knowing when in the academic spaces to exercise either silence, limit their candor, or even manage their own egos. And so there are unique characteristics of academic consciousness. And some of those are, it's both inclusive of Du Bois's double consciousness, seeing yourself through the eyes of others, and Frantz Fanon's triple consciousness, and understanding that their Black body is often perceived and how they show up in a particular way by other students, faculty, and colleagues. And sometimes that helped to fuel their agency, but for some Black students, tokenism can be a place of advocacy and resistance, and students may elect to promote activism or champion deeper, sustained action around diversity at their institutions, despite the cost, because of what they hope it's going to do for others later on. And oftentimes, students feel like they don't have a choice and that they cannot opt out. Even with perceived individual benefits to tokenization, so for example, additional funding or leadership opportunities, tokenization is not beneficial to Black and brown students. It doesn't help them because of the white hegemonic foundations upon which the white US higher education is established. Tokenism and the goodwill of a few devoted white people cannot change structures. That would need to be undone in order to advance racial justice. That's Fagan. There is a text written by Jacob Tobia, and it's related to gender, but it applies because Jacob is talking about tokenism. And Jacob says the whole point of being a token is that you exchange your rage at inequality for the respect and admiration of your peers. You trade in your right to be angry, your right to be dissatisfied, for the right to be hugged and affirmed by those around you. You stop pointing out the ways in which people are hurting you or making your identity feel impossible unless it is self-serving. You stop pointing out the fact that you're the only one like you. You take the fact that there's only one of you, or in some cases that there are very few like you, and instead of treating that fact as what it is, damning evidence of exclusion and discrimination, you treat it as evidence that you're special. So to sincerely adopt the psychology of tokenism, you have to sell your community out. And that's sort of the dark underbelly of the thing. And so instead of blaming institutions, rules, and the social attitudes of those around you for the absence of other people like you, you blame your own community. And that could happen too. And that's some of the intra-racial dynamics that happen to exist, which also undermines inclusion. So I do have some recommendations. I would not be a scholar practitioner unless I recommended some things. So I have 4. First, name the problem. The problem is white supremacy. So transformational change at predominantly white institutions requires interruption to business as usual. For otherwise, these institutions will continue to maintain white supremacy and racism. So white supremacy is the it's the social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other ethnic groups. Indeed, explicitly naming this pattern within predominantly white institutions is the first step in successfully combating it. White supremacist logic portrays whiteness as normal or traditional, even when considering the reality of the non-white global majority. So 2, stop using white supremacist logic. So white supremacists and racist models insist that Blackness is a source of racial problems. It's a source of racial problems. However, the actual problem remains the negative perceptions of Blackness, which spaces Blackness is allowed to occupy. These racist perceptions remain supported, funded, and reinforced by institutional racism. So 3, resituate language. So the social and political construction of racism and white supremacy don't have to remain normalized in the future of PWIs. The language we use and how racism shapes our institutions is critical. So how we situate that language has an impact. So for instance, consider the difference between naming that an individual experienced racism because they're Black versus describing that the person experienced racism because of bigots, right? So because of the bigotry of racists, right? This kind of reframing may also help address internalized oppression or the perceived benefits of tokenism that tokenized students may hold. 4, look at the bottom. So that's Matsuda, 1987. So in many instances, traditional institutional change models derive from white supremacist ideologies and are unable and ill-equipped to yield equity-centered transformation. So current administrators and policymakers who serve as institutional actors could make shifts towards inclusive policies and practices to interrupt systems designed to tokenize students. So critical legal scholar Matsuda describes a practice of looking at the bottom. And what Matsuda says that it's also called turning attention to those who have been felt and who have felt the falsity of liberal promise. In looking to the bottom, institutional actors would be more likely to address the systemic practices that perpetuate white supremacy, racism, and oppression in higher education. And as a result, these findings and accounts from tokenized Black graduate students at predominantly white institutions are critical not only for understanding the breadth and harm inflicted on the student population, but for also elucidating the possibilities for institutional transformation. And I'll just close with this because I usually close with a quote. If it is true, this is by Luis Yaco. If it is true that education is the main foundation of any society, it follows that the state of race in today's America mirrors its education system. Therefore, America's education needs serious examination and even remaking. It is a system that uses Blacks and other marginalized and minoritized people as mere tokens. You see, a meager quota of Black people as employees or students here and there gives the false impression of equity. Thank you very much. I also want to thank my research assistant, Melanie Pagan, for helping me craft this presentation. It would not be as aesthetically pleasing without her. I would also like to thank the co-author of this work, one of my former research assistants, and that's Ijeoma Ninjaka. So I will now take it off of slideshow.
Okay, Deniece, thank you so much. As has been the case in the past, I have learned again from you, and I just want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. Really important stuff. Lots in there to unpack and to continue to learn with you and from you.